Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar, the new code for professional lobbying. So while everybody's joining, I'll just say a few words. This webinar will explain what is contained within the new code with a kind of in-depth look at some of the new additions and the rules. We'll have some scenarios and then there'll be some time at the end for questions as well. It's worth mentioning that this webinar is being recorded and then at a later date it will be published on our YouTube channel, and we'll share that link over socials once it's ready. I will be acting as Stuart's Debbie McGee, so I will be putting in links into the chat, and I'll also put my email in there as well. So as always, if you have any questions, please drop me an email afterwards. So I'll now, I think I can see the participants numbers about the right level. So I'll pass over to you, Stuart, and I'll pop my camera off.
Louise, thank you. Yeah, no, look, thank you. Unfortunately, there's very little magic included in the next hour. We've got to talk about the new code, and welcome everyone. Welcome this morning. If there's any problems, do feel free to put any comments in the chat as we go through. As Louise said, look, we'll have some Q&A time at the end, but I'm honestly very happy to take questions as we go through today. And look, obviously there was a previous iteration to the code for professional lobbying, so I apologize in advance if I start using the old terminology. I too have to get used to the fact we're rules and not clauses, and we're professional lobbying, not public affairs code and things like that as well. So please do stay with me. But I might turn off my camera in a second as well, because there's no point you staring at me. We can concentrate on the slides as we go through. So look, there we go. Let me just do that. Cool, thank you. So look, thanks very much for joining us today. So Louise said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the code as it is now. We'll start by just touching on the role of ethics in lobbying and public affairs as well, because I think it sets the scene for why we have the old code and obviously particularly the new code as well. And also we'll just cover the requirement for the statutory registers as well, sort of outside of what we do as the PRCA. So my name is Stuart Thompson. I'm a long-standing public affairs practitioner, 25 plus years, currently run my own business, CWE Communications, but I train obviously on public affairs. I've written some books. There's even a podcast as well, and I'm on the board of the PRCA as well, and the treasurer of the PRCA. So anyway, that's enough about me. Let's concentrate on the code. First of all, I suppose it's just to reflect on why we've updated the code and why some of the terminology has changed, and which we'll go through over the next hour as well. But I think fundamentally it was really just to make it clearer and easier to understand. So I remember when I used to do this training for the old code, I would have to pick out, I can't remember how many, Louise will probably remind me, but you know how many clauses there were under the old code, but it was sort of 16, 18 or whatever it was, and I would pick out some of the main ones. Actually, with this code, with the updated code, what we've got is a much smaller number, so it's clearer, it's easier to understand, and really the code is there so that we each as individuals know our role. We know and understand the sort of the behavior and the ethical standards that are expected of us, and also if something were to go wrong, if we were to step over that line, what the consequences would be to that, and how that would play out. Because it's critically important that we maintain trust in our professions. We maintain trust in our profession by adhering to those ethical standards and behaviours that the code sort of sets out. We all know and understand why reputation is so important to everything we do. You know, if you're working in charities, it might be that reputation helps attract funding. If you're in a consultancy role, it may be that it's a way that you attract business. But fundamentally, at the heart of public affairs is the need to engage with a range of political audiences. And that's not just politicians, it could be civil servants and others. And frankly, they need to know and understand that we have those ethical standards as well. If we can't do that, then there's always a question mark, if I think, beside how well we can do our job. Why would any of those audiences really want to talk to us and engage with us if there's a danger that they're working with an organization or alongside a person that doesn't maintain those sorts of standards? So I think it's pretty fundamental to everything we do. It's not just good business practice, though. It's other professions. Other professions have these codes and standards. So why should lobbying, professional lobbying, public affairs be any different? It helps you to work with colleagues as well. So, if you're in an in-house role, which many of you wouldn't doubtless be on the call today, it means that when you're talking to those colleagues internally and they want to know and understand what lobbying is about, then you can explain that on the basis of those ethical standards. Same, suppliers might not work with organizations if they don't have faith in the standards that they adhere to as well. So I think there's a whole range of different reasons that it's really important that we have this code for professional lobbying that reminds us all of our requirements as well. And at the end of the day, and I suppose this is maybe a bit more of me with the bald hat on, but I think it is that part of that PRCA stamp of approval. It's a quality mark, if you like. And if you're in the consultancy, I say, some may use that to attract business as well. So there may be that element to it as well. So look, I'm not here to say, why you should adhere to it and all those sorts of things. You are PRCA members. You adhere to the code, and that code is the code for professional lobbying now. And what I will say, just at the outset, just for clarity purposes as well, this is a new code. This is a revision to the old one. And in the same way as the old code, if people ask me difficult questions, if I can put it like that, I don't make stuff up about this. If I don't know the answer, if it's not clear, then I retain the right to go back to the PRCA, discuss it, and come back to anybody that has that sort of question. But I think particularly with the new code, there will always be sort of grey areas. There will always be bits that we're not quite sure about. It's not up to me to make up, the PRCA's policy on the hoof. So that's my little caveat, just to say, if I'm not sure, I'll say I don't know, and I'll get some, further advice as well. Sorry, hope that's not too difficult. So, but look, why is there even a need to have that code in the first place? Well, look, the reality is that if you look back over the years, some more historic than others, but there's always a misunderstanding, or has been in the past, about lobbying. The trouble is that comes from a place of truth. That it was the fact that businesses paid politicians to undertake parliamentary activity. And that's not me being salacious or gossipy or anything along those sorts of lines. That is the reality. There were court cases. So Mohammed Al Fayed, who unfortunately, well, I mean, I have to be slightly careful about how you describe people like him, especially given the recent coverage and the powerful testimony that was given by a number of women. But before that, he was better known as the chairman of Fulham Football Club, owner of Harrods, and father of Dodi Al Fayed, who was killed in the car crash with Princess Diana. And indeed, they are the bits that were repeated when he died a couple of years ago. But the other bit of his background was he paid politicians to undertake parliamentary activity. And again, that was mentioned in those obituaries as well. So that's at the sort of the tail end of the the Tory mid-90s Tory government under John Major. Fast forward a couple of years into the new Labour years, and you get the same sorts of issues. You get the same sorts of problems, that sort of cash for questions or access issues. So, there's a front page. In fact, it's there, the Observer. There are 27 people, I think it was, in this new Labour government that make all the decisions, and I know all of them. So, a selling access type lobbying sleaze, if you like. And unfortunately, that has tended to stick around. Look, if any of you say to parents, loved ones, family, friends, whatever, what do you do? And you say you're a lobbyist. The chances are the first thing that they will come to mind is brown envelopes full of cash pay. And that is so far from the reality, but we have to overcome that. That's part of our responsibilities as individuals, as well as the PRCA itself, but as individuals to overcome those misperceptions. As a result of those earlier incarnations and sleaze, there was an APPC, so a set up, a sort of a voluntary body, if you like, of some of the leading players in the lobbying industry to overcome, and they were the first code, if you like, voluntary code to come through. And so that was created. And then in 2018, if memory serves me correctly, that came together with the PRCA to create the Public Affairs Board, because effectively we had sort of, I suppose, in that sense, two voluntary codes. It wasn't very clear. So again, back to that idea of reassuring the public and maybe reassuring the audiences that we deal with that actually, we can, look after ourselves. We do hit these standards. So you had that unified approach under the PRCA. And look, it's not that all the problems of the world have been solved by having the voluntary code, PRCA code, in place. But if you look at more recent allegations of lobbying sleaze type things, do they involve PRCA members? No, they don't. And it's very often, journalists posing. Not always, I hasten to add. I'm not trying to, but and it's not that that sort of journalistic activity isn't entirely right. But journalists saying they're lobbyists, offering suitcases full of cash to politicians, and then adding two and two and coming up with a lobbying sleaze story. So it has shifted, and there's no doubt that having the code in place has undoubtedly helped. And look, I hope I don't have to sort of go through too much of this with anybody on the call today. But the reality is that government needs lobbying. And that's not me saying that. I mean, from an organizational perspective, or if we're in-house or we've got clients or whatever, then why do we do it? Why are we, we have to remember we're trying to influence government. That is what we are trying to do. We are trying to influence public policy outcomes. And government, as we'll come on and talk about in terms of the definition, we have to think about what government means so that we all know whether we are involved in professional lobbying or not. But that can be really important to businesses. It can help understanding, but most importantly, it just delivers better government. It delivers better policy outcomes, better decisions from government. Because without the information and the data and the experience and all these other things that we as organizations or our, for our clients can bring to government just doesn't have that information. It needs that information to make the decisions. And when the government were looking at the statutory lobbying register, which again we'll come on to a bit later, in the consultation paper, when it was thinking about this, it says lobbying serves an important function in politics. By putting forward the views of stakeholders to policymakers, it helps in the development of better legislation. So they know that, but we have to continually show to them, I believe, that they can have faith in that information. They can have faith in the representations that are put to them. And we can do that by adhering to the code and having that code in place. So what is sort of public affairs and lobbying within the PRCA? Well, amongst the membership of the PRCA, it's about 140 organisations. They come from mainly consultancies, but a lot of in-house teams and individual members as well. I'm an individual member of the PRCA. So in total, that's about just shy of sort of 2,500 public affairs practitioners, professional lobbyists, if you like. And then the register, which we'll talk about the register in a second as well, about 3,000 clients on that lobbying register. We have the Public Affairs Board. So the Public Affairs Board still exists. Its role has changed under the new code. And again, I'll explain that in a second. But the Public Affairs Board, you can be elected to the board, you can stand for election to the board. And that now its role is very much in helping to sort of shape best practice, maintain standards, a role in helping professional development and education, champion, if you like, for the public affairs sector as a whole. And there is also a next gen public affairs group as well, which represents young practitioners. Sadly, I'm much too old to be involved in that group whatsoever. In fact, if I was, I might get some strange looks. Anyway, the emphasis under the new code, and in terms of the, and it's not policing, because I don't, that's not the right word, but if we're trying to sort of visualize, if you like, what the standards committee helps us to do in terms of oversight of the code. It's the standards committee that has sort of taken that over, if you like, from the public affairs board. So the board is there for championing and professional development and other stuff that we just talked about. The standards committee is the bit that really helps us build the code and decide on what that contains and look at potential breaches as well. And by shifting it away, it provides independence. And I think particularly when we're talking about issues around potential breaches, that's really important. We don't want any idea that, this is us marking our own homework, that, that we as the PRCA or other public affairs practitioners, are too closely aligned to this, because that doesn't give that independence. That doesn't give the public, if you like, and audiences the faith in what it is we're doing and the way that we I was going to say control. That's too strong a word. But the way that this is the oversight, I think, is probably what I'm trying to say. So look, so for the standards committee, majority of members come from outside the industry. Really important, I think. Their role is to determine the codes of conduct and the code for professional lobbying. Again, we'll come on to the codes in a second. They also then look at when a complaint is made, they can decide whether it to sort of escalate that complaint, if you like, and whether it is a complaint worthy of further investigation. So they are the sort of these words aren't quite right, so I don't want you to take them too literally, but almost the gatekeepers to that process. And again, because they come from outside the industry, it's that independence, so they can really look at these things rather than automatically triggering complaints processes, etc. They can decide that, and then to decide if there's to be an investigation. And then if there is an investigation, they can sort of decide on those complaints and have the power of sanction as well. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, when we're thinking about this new code and the way that it works, think about the role of the standards committee. Really important. So as I say, look, determine the codes of conduct and the code of professional lobbying, and the procedure under which complaints made under the codes of conduct are to be investigated. So in that sense, a powerful body, an important body, an independent body. And again, let's just grip hold of that. Let's keep that in our mind as being one of the most important parts. Again, because we're going back to what we touched on right at the at the start, which is, how do we maintain confidence in our profession? This is one way to do that. So look, just a little bit of background. To remind ourselves that the code professional lobbying replaces the previous public affairs code. So delete all references to the public affairs code, etc., from your minds, which I'm desperately trying to do as well, because I've got so familiar with it over the years. I've got to move on from that as well. And that the new code came about through a two-stage consultation. This was taken out to the industry so that we could look at, and properly assess, or say we, sorry, I wasn't involved in it. It was the independent, it was the standards committee, because otherwise there wouldn't be an independent. So the standards committee are absolutely in charge. But we, in a royal we sense, could look at what the views were, where the old code didn't work, maybe where it wasn't clear enough, and assess that and bring that forward, that new code. So, and as I mentioned, and we've got it here. So the old code had 21 clauses. We now have 8 rules. Makes it clearer language, helps us all understand what our requirements are as individuals. And I'll come on to a couple of the key changes under the new code, but I think one of those, and I think this is one that came through loud and clear in some of the consultations as well, is not, so as members, in-house consultancy, not allowed to employ MPs, peers, and non-exec directors. And that's a new part, non-exec directors, because that was thought it was needed to broaden that, because non-execs were not new, but newer in terms of their role in government than when the code was originally drafted, or when there was originally the original Public Affairs Code. So being really clear on those roles and what you're not allowed to employ, really clear. So that's in the code. And another aspect for that is again, I'll come on to this in a bit more detail in a second, more requirements. So if you do have lords employed or something along those lines, but not in a public affairs role, I hasten to add, or professional lobbying role, sorry, there's an additional requirement about transparency. And again, heavy emphasis on transparency. And also, just to mention at this point, and it's one that I'll return to again, is that whilst today I concentrate on the code for professional lobbying, which affects all of those that are involved in professional lobbying and public affairs, there is also an overarching PRCA code of conduct as well, of which you should all be familiar with. So slightly broader, but the two very much are complementary to one another. Very much, as PRCA members, you are meant to be familiar with both. And the reason for mentioning that in particular at this stage is that wider PRCA code has a requirement on members to report serious breaches when they become aware of them. And I think that's particularly important in the public affairs setting, not that because there are more potential breaches or anything silly along those sorts of lines, but again, with that view to maintaining public trust and that of our key stakeholders. Thank you, Louise, for putting the links into the chat as we're going through as well. If you see the breaches, you have to report them, and that's part of our requirement now. So how do we uphold the standards? Well, what are the standards, if you like? Well, I always think that actually, if you grip hold of one word during any of these sorts of trainings on ethics and codes, it's about transparency. If you keep an eye on, if you keep a view to transparency in your head, in your work, you're not going to go too far wrong, I don't think. So transparency, openness, and no financial relationship with those politicians and advisors. It's important to remember that applies equally to, or the requirements apply equally to clients or employers, whether they pay fees or not. So again, if you are doing a piece of sort of free public affairs work or professional lobbying work, say pro bono or something along those sort of lines, it's always the fact that you are doing the professional lobbying, not the size of the income or the client that you're doing it for. And also, it changes. Look, we're talking about some pretty big changes that have happened when the code came in, just very recently, at the beginning of September. In fact, extremely recently. Sorry, I'm losing track of time, especially with the party conferences coming up. Anyway, and Lib Dems having had theirs this week. So, but it's a living code. It has been updated and can be updated in future as well. So, in other words, as expectations change, as new roles in government emerge, a bit like non-execs type thing, PRCA will continue to make sure that this code lives and breathes and develops as is required to maintain that trust. If there's any gap, then that sort of suggests that code needs updating, I think. And I say there are some obligations. There are some obligations on all of us. I suppose the one that tends to signal, actually the second one here, which is about the entry onto the register. So that quarterly submission to the register, that remains in place. So that is still there. There's a complaints procedure, which, as I say, it's changed in the sense that the Standards Committee are now sort of leading on that, but that is still there as well. And there is also a very clear call out in the code in the UK. I think it's clearer than the previous version, personally. Members got to familiarise themselves with the provisions of the code, and company members must provide access to training to ensure their employees and contractors are aware of and understand provisions of the code as well. So I think a clearer requirement on all of us directly to know and understand the code. And again, here, I would just direct to the PRCA website. The PRCA website has a, it obviously has the code. Otherwise, that would be a bit weird if it didn't. The code is there as well. But there's also some really useful guidance as well, in a sort of a Q&A format. But there's some really useful guidance, there, which is sort of what we've tried to do is think about some of the scenarios that will come up. And I go through a couple of scenarios at the end, just so that we can reflect on what we've talked about this morning. But I would refer you back to those things. So basically, if you use the time that we have here today just to, just to get to think about it and just become a bit more aware, but then I suppose in that sense, go away and do your homework, and read those documents on the website to give you that sort of, backup, hopefully what I've been saying in today's session. So I suppose the most important place to start is the definition. How do we know that we're doing professional lobbying? Well, the code says professional lobbying are activities which are carried out in the course of a business for the purposes of influencing or others. Sorry, if I can read properly would really help, wouldn't it? Or advising others how to influence the public functions of a relevant public body. I'll come on to those in a second. So again, we're back to that idea of, look, what are we here to do? We're here to influence. We're here to influence those public policy outcomes across. And again, this relevant public body is a wider definition than we had under the previous code, which we talked about government. But again, the way that I tend to think about it in my own head, and again, a lot of this is how you personally think about these things and apply them to your own work. Is however I'm trying to secure that influence. That's the bit that I have in my head. That's the bit. So if I'm trying to influence, who am I trying to influence? Are they a relevant public body? If they are, then we're under that. Then we're under the code. We're captured by the code. But that influencing word, I think, is really important. So influencing is about informing, advising, advocating as well. And again, I think that's a clearer way to look at influencing than under the previous code, for particular points of interest or points of view. And then the relevant public body, central government, devolved government, local government, ministers, officials, special advisors, particular call out to them under the new code, elected members and staff, other bodies that may have a public function. Now that is slightly broad out because it's really difficult to capture all of those. But again, in my own head, I think about that as being, other bits of the public sector, that be, regulators or, advisory committees, those sorts of things. Again, look, that's just me. That's just the way that I interpret that, because they have a public function. They're doing a job for government, but they may not necessarily be a bit of government. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to tell what's in government and what's out. But if they're serving a public function and having an influence on that public policy decision, then for me, that's in there. That would be my interpretation of that. So look, I say under the old code, I had to sort of pick out the main bits. With this, we've got 8. I can go through them, but I will call out a couple in particular as we go. But rule 1: members must disclose the identity of their client, or applicable their employer, on whose behalf they are making representations upon the first contact with a relevant public body, and must not mislead anybody to their client's interests. So again, for me, this is the transparency one. This is the one that says, this is the rule that says, rather than having oblique conversations about, your particular concern about, pharmaceutical, actually, if you work for insert name of company, literally in that first conversation, in that first contact, you're clear in who you work for. Why? because otherwise you're putting an unfair onus. Is it an onus? I don't know. Anyway, but anyway, it's unfair on the person you're trying to engage with because they don't actually know, they don't really understand where you're coming from because you haven't been clear, I would contend. Rule 2, members must advise their clients, or where applicable their employer, if their instructions, if carried out, would be likely to entail a breach of the PRCA code of conduct or this code. So the code of conduct, I mentioned that broader one that applies to everybody, or this code, particularly for professional lobbying. Part of what we have to do is educate others. And I mean that in a way that just sort of says, look, we maintain these ethical standards. And we might have to tell others about that. We might have to tell our clients or our colleagues, our employer, whatever, about the code and the fact that there are certain things we can't do. So can you shove a load of cash the way of a parliamentarian? No, of course you can't. That might be completely obvious to us, but actually we might need to explain that. But we can use the code as a way of explaining that as well. So it helps to put us in those conversations as well. Rule 3, members must not make exaggerated or misleading statements to the extent of their influence on or access to relevant public bodies or individuals within those organisations. So this is trying to avoid that little black book style of professional lobbying, if you like. And I'm doubtless there are some out there that would try and do that. Under our code, that is not acceptable. Now, that is not to say that you can't talk about knowing and understanding government, regularly working with, etc., etc. But what you're not saying is, don't worry, I know Keir Starmer. He pops around our house on a Sunday for a barbecue and a pint over as we watch the Arsenal game. I can have a chat with him about this. First of all, can I just make it completely clear that none of that is true? Just for total transparency. And frankly, it wouldn't work anyway, but that's not the point. The point is, I am not trying to, mislead, flog, or whatever on the basis of that sort of exaggerated claim about a contact, which say is not true anyway. So, rule 4. Now, I think rule 4 is if there are certain bits of these, these new rules that are particularly important, rule 4 is at the heart of it, which is about and I won't read through all of this, but it does talk about members. I'll pick on 4A. Members must not engage any MP, member of the House of Lords, or any member of a devolved legislature to carry out professional lobbying, and the non-exec director bit. So that is here under clause 4. And then, if you do employ people not to do professional lobbying, as I say, but in some other role within the organization, some political board or something like that, maybe, there are extra requirements. So they have to, as part of the returns, there's a declaration to the PRCA, and particular need to say, look, this person knows that they can't do this sort of work. We are confident they aren't doing it. That sort of thing. So that's what we're really trying to do. So it's an additional level of confidence in the code, an additional level of confidence in the returns, and an additional onus on the employer as well. So I think I would call out clause 4 as particularly important. Rule 5, members must avoid actual or apparent conflicts of interest, which are likely to avoid between. I won't read out the whole thing. Again, I'm a big fan of having worked for law firms for a very long time. They take their conflicts of interest incredibly seriously. I think this rule really helps us to step up to the requirement that is expected of other professions. So those conflicts of interest, we just can't have them. We'd like to arise between their professional lobbying and their personal affairs, their work or professional outside lobbying work. Members must not be involved in professional lobbying seeking to influence an organisation in which they hold a role. Again, the particular emphasis here is on us as individuals. So let's think. So if you are a Labour Party member and you do lots of lots of campaigning work locally, you might think that it's okay to have conversations with senior parliamentarians, members of the cabinet, etc., etc. Well, it is, but again, you would have to think about the person on the receiving end. Is it clear that you are having that conversation on the basis of your professional life as opposed to your party activity? So again, back to my earlier point, transparency. If you think about transparency and that approach, particularly in this setting, I don't think you go far wrong. 6 members, and this isn't a change from the previous one. And again, members must not hold a pass conferring access to Westminster, devolved legislature, associated department or agency. There may be exceptional circumstances. It's not up to me to decide what those would be, obviously. But I think there have been issues in the past around sort of childcare and those sorts of things. So, but it will be looked at and a decision published. So again, from the PRCA's perspective, transparency on that as well. Now, Rule 7, I haven't included the whole of Rule 7 because Rule 7 is quite long. But again, this is the bit that sits with Rule 4. So in other words, if you do have that requirement to provide more information, then this is the clause that goes through the information that you have to provide. I say I won't go through it in detail here, but it sits alongside, I think, Rule 4. And then Rule 8, members are required to familiarise themselves with the provision of this code, and company members must provide access to training. So again, back to that point, you need to know and understand the training. I've mentioned this earlier, so I won't repeat it. So look, in terms of the code, that's it. So, and I hope you'll agree, we'll talk about statutory codes in a second, which may be a little bit more complicated, but, in terms of what we're trying to do here, much clearer, much easier to understand, and, don't take that long to go through, really. And that has to, I think, that has to be a good thing, because it just shows that, they're, quite easily, hopefully, I've done a good job, but easily understandable. But again, don't just take this as the ultimate, word on anything of these things. Go back to the links that Louise has popped into the chat and spend some time with them. So look, that's all voluntary. That's the voluntary code. But we then have the statutory requirements as well. Now, again, I'm not going to go through the statutory requirements in any, great, shape or anything along those sort of lines. This is really just a reminder that in Westminster, for consultant lobbyists, again, I think I've got a bit in here about here we go, consultant lobbyists and what counts. For consultant lobbyists, so not in-house, different, very different from the PRCA approach. Consultant lobbyists, there are certain types of work that you have to declare. If you are, written or, contact with, ministers, permanent secretary, so the highest level of the civil servants, civil service, that is consultant lobbying. It's quite a narrow definition, I think, but, again, personal opinion. I think they may well change it over the years, but they haven't shown any great indication of doing so yet. But that is the law. So whilst, for PRCA membership, if a firm were to employ a politician, for instance, and they weren't a PRCA member, we can't do anything about that. We can call it out. We could try and impact on reputation and call out and sort of make the point of distinction between a PRCA member and how they work and a non-PRCA member. But, there's not much we can do about it. Whereas the statutory requirement, okay, there are proper, scary, outcomes if you don't follow the law. So that's just, I suppose, just a reminder. So that's around the, Westminster. Scotland, I think, is if I was to, it's just easier to understand. It's more comprehensive, I think. And not least, it's there are huge costs associated with registering on the Westminster one that don't apply to the Scottish one from a business perspective, I think that has to be good as well. And it has a very clear look. If you're lobbying an NFP, here's how you behave. And then a big long list, not long list, but a comprehensive list of if you're engaging with any of these types of audiences, special advisors, etc., etc. Again, you know that you have to register it. So I think it's a better code. I think it's clearer. No code is completely without, even ours. I'm sure people will, challenge us in some areas. Maybe it's, we could pick up in a future iteration. So no code is ever 100% completely, satisfying everybody. But I would point to, out of the statutory codes, the Scottish one as being a better one, I think. The Senate in Wales, they've had, now a couple of years ago, I think, and I did check on this the other day, but they've had a committee that looked at it. I don't think it's reported yet, but I'm very happy to be corrected by anybody that knows that's a bit closer to the Welsh situation than I am. But there might be reform, I think, is the general. So not at the moment, but they may well apply. And of course, if you do lobbying in Europe and in other countries, the US, Canada, Australia, I think, New Zealand, I can't remember. Anyway, I suppose that's my general plea to say that whilst we have the voluntary PRCA code and a PRCA member, you are covered. Don't forget the legal stuff as well. Those. Look, it would be really great if we didn't have to have codes. I mean, I think, but the reality is we do. The reality is we have to prove to a range of audiences that that we adhere to standards. And we have to, the code is written in a way that, if a sort of reasonable member of the public came along and thought, is this person, is this organization, is this lobbyist, professional lobbyist acting in an ethical way, then we could hand on heart say, yeah, we are. You will always get some that will, don't like lobbying, don't want, particularly businesses, but any organization particularly involved in that. But, would that be a reasonable position to take? No. I would say that I work in lobbying, but is that reasonable member of the public? If they think that we are doing the right thing and behaving the right way, that's sort of the basis of the code, if you like. That's how it's, and there are, not often, but there are allegations thrown out about, lobbyists, say not PRCA members, but we have to show that we do have those standards. We have to show that we do have a process in place through the standards committee that action, can be taken. And sometimes it's not that people set out to do things wrongly or incorrectly or anything along those sort of lines. Sometimes these things can emerge. But if we've all got, and again, as the code makes clear, if we've all got an awareness of what the requirements are, if we see a piece of work going in a direction that is incompatible potentially with the code, if we see the behavior of others that we can rectify, back to the main PRCA code of conduct as well, if we see, what we think is maybe a, again, I choose my terminology correctly here, but a sort of almost a deliberate, sorry, I was going to say misapplication of the rules. That's not what I mean at all. But if we see somebody we think is doing the wrong thing, then we have a requirement to call it out, as well. So that stewardship is not just the requirement of the senior leadership team, of your manager or anything along those lines. It's all of us. We all have that role. We all have to be aware, and we all have to have that in mind when we're doing our work, I think. So look, I just want to finish with a couple of sort of points just to throw out, and then a couple of scenarios. But look, please do get those questions ready. And if I can answer them, I will. And if I can't, then I'll refer to Louise and I will refer to the PRCA. Party conferences, some people go on party conference pass, for instance, member pass. In the sense that, that's fine, you can do, but what I would absolutely call out there, and is totally essential, and I think it's back to, I think it's clause 1, but it's about the transparency. So if you're going on a party member pass, okay, But if you're then having any conversation about work, you are not, Stuart Thompson, member of insert name of constituency or branch or ward or whatever it happens to be. You are having that conversation on Stuart Thompson, working with insert name of client. So again, transparency is hugely important. Another issue which sometimes comes up is around, a campaign. Now, a campaign might start out as a piece of, I don't know, local information, profile raising, something along those sort of lines. That's all fine. But then actually maybe the shift of the focus, the focus shifts towards local councillors, politicians, something along those sort of lines. What happens then? Well, in those circumstances, actually, it's becoming a public affairs piece, a professional lobbying piece of work potentially. It's say around a development. So there's a political outcome in the sense that a decision has to be made by politicians to allow that that development to happen. Suddenly, it's become a piece of public affairs work. Now, that's fine. These changes can happen, but if we're then aware, we can then start applying the needs and the requirements of the code to that piece of work. Or if we're not involved and it's a colleague, telling them about it as well. Again, that requirement is on us as well as individuals. So, there's a couple of things that come up. What about some scenarios? Let's just run through a couple of scenarios just to sort of finish off today. After winning a highly competitive pitch process, a new client who works in a controversial sector and has long had reputational challenges suddenly become reticent. Public affairs register. I thought I got my terminology wrong there for a minute. I was about to. Anyway, they suggest various ways to get around it, such as the agency being paid by a subsidiary company to mask who's really paying the bills, or being subcontracted out by a PR company and not declaring the end client. As the potential account manager, what should your approach be and what would you say to the client? And I'll just give you a couple of moments to tap some answers into the chat, if that's okay. We've had one question in already, and I'll deal with. We use first names when they come through. Only I can see them. I won't give second names out in a second. So, Zach, I'll come on to your question in a sec. Any thoughts on this? What would the approach be? See a few of them typing stuff in, so I'll just hang fire for a second. Yeah, look, I mean, a couple of people have come back. Yes, I mean, transparency. Thank you. Yeah, nice to have. Yeah, no, that word I think is right. Look, rule one. If we pop back to rule one just for a second, if I can do that. Right, here we go. Members must disclose the identity of their clients and advise their clients, rule two, of the code as well. So what, look, what we're saying here is that, some sort of, or the suggestion would be, we're not saying, but the suggestion would be actually, look, that's not appropriate. You can't sort of bypass the rules by having a sort of a separate payment system, which, takes you outside of those requirements. That's not, for us as individuals, we are still the ones doing the work. So it is still, it is still our requirement to stick by the code and the transparency and being honest and all that sort of stuff. That's there. So I think you're entirely right. Those that have put that into the chat. And I think the other bit just to add to that, and why in particular mentioning account manager here, is sometimes it's just useful to remind, so, we, whatever our level in an organization, should know and understand that. It might not be, as an account manager, for instance, it might not be your responsibility to have the conversation with the client. That's fine. That might be an account director or whatever levels you have in your particular organization. But that conversation still needs to be had. There is no bypassing the rules simply to try and, cover it up in some way, I suppose, in that way. Thank you for your comments on that one. Let's do another one. Alex Moore is a consultant. He has managed to get an invitation to a drinks reception in Parliament, which is being attended by a number of MPs and their researchers who have an interest in financial services. Alex has a number, of banking clients and is keen to make an impression. In particular, he wants to talk to Chris Tompkins MP, the chair of the Financial Services APPG, about his client Banks Are For You, whose chief exec has been criticised by the APPG following a rather large bonus distribution. How does Alex go about speaking to Chris Tompkins MP? And again, I'll give you a few moments to type some things into the chat on any thoughts that you have on the approach that should be taken in that interaction. Yeah, sorry, I can see some chats, some responses coming in. Thank you. Alice, yeah, Steve, thank you. Yeah. Again, transparency. Transparency has to be the key here. You know, it's not that the code is trying to stop you having conversations with anybody. That would be, well, wrong, misplaced, misguided, whatever. You know, this is not about here. It's about being the identity of the client. So you don't sidle up to Chris Tompkins and say, "Oh my word, I was really interested in the report that you came out with recently. You know, what drove that?" You know, and have a general chat, because that's not being transparent. That's not being honest with the person you're trying to have a conversation with. You know, that first interaction needs to say, "This is the client." Now, that puts Chris Tompkins in a position where they can then decide whether to have that conversation. They may decide they don't want to talk to you. That's absolutely their prerogative. Equally, it might be the bit of the conversation that then changes the dynamic there, that allows that conversation and that engagement to then take place. So transparency as well. So look, just remains for me to say thank you very much for attending. And thank you for your contributions in the scenarios and the chat generally as well. And look, thank you very much. And as Louise has quite rightly put in there, she's put her contact details in there as well, and a little friendly reminder that the register is opened on the October the 1st for 2 weeks to get those submissions and those that transparency requirement absolutely submitted. Thank you all for your time. Hope to see you in person soon. Thank you.